During a lavish charity gala in Manhattan, Emily balanced a crystal tray, weaving between tables at the city's most exclusive event. Her simple uniform stood in stark contrast to the designer gowns and bespoke suits around her. As she approached the main table to serve champagne, Richard Caldwell raised a dismissive hand. "Just a waitress," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't involve yourself in conversations that are beyond your world." The ballroom fell silent. All eyes turned to her. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers tightening on the tray. The humiliation burned in her cheeks, but something stronger glinted in her eyes. She lifted her chin and in a clear voice that cut through the silence, she replied in fluent English. "When you underestimate someone based on their job, you reveal more about your character than theirs." The crowd murmured in surprise. Richard's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, Emily continued in French. "Les vrais leaders ne diminuent jamais les autres pour se sentir supérieurs. True leaders never diminish others to feel superior." Then, in German, "Wahre Größe zeigt sich darin, wie man andere behandelt. True greatness is shown in how you treat others." In Italian, "La dignità non dipende dal lavoro che si fa, ma da come si fa." Dignity doesn't depend on the work you do, but how you do it. And finally, in Spanish, "El conocimiento no tiene clase social, señor." Knowledge has no social class, sir. The ballroom remained in complete silence. The looks of disdain had turned to surprise, then fascination. Emily had just demonstrated fluency in 5 languages, each phrase carefully chosen to expose Richard's arrogance. Helen, the event supervisor, watched from the sidelines, her eyes wide. She had known Emily for 2 years, ever since the young woman had started working to pay for school, but she had never witnessed anything like this. The 23-year-old girl, who always arrived 15 minutes early and never complained about double shifts, had just silenced one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. Richard rose slowly, his imposing height casting a shadow over Emily. His icy blue eyes studied her as if she were a puzzle he needed to solve. The other guests remained in suspense, awaiting his reaction. "Impressive," he finally said, his voice laced with skepticism. "An interesting performance. But repeating memorized phrases doesn't mean you understand real-world complexities." He turned back to the table, gesturing to the scattered documents. "We were discussing a merger between European companies involving regulations in 4 different countries. Contracts potentially worth $300 million. Emily took a step forward, her eyes quickly scanning the visible documents. "The German contract has a problematic clause in Article 15.3, she said calmly. "The translation is incorrect. Haftungsausschluss doesn't just mean disclaimer of liability in this context. It means you are assuming full liability for any future environmental damages." The lawyer seated at the table snatched the papers, his eyes racing over the text. His expression slowly shifted from confidence to concern. "She's right," he muttered. "How did we miss that?" Richard stood motionless for a few seconds, processing what had just happened. A waitress had identified an error his million-dollar lawyers had missed, an error that could have cost his company hundreds of millions. "A lucky guess," he said finally, his voice tighter. "You must have overheard our earlier conversation." "No," Emily replied firmly. "I read legal German because I've been studying international law at the public library for 3 years, every night after my second job." Helen approached nervously, her hands trembling slightly. She had built her reputation organizing events for Manhattan's elite, and now she feared it would all crumble because of this public confrontation. "Mr. Caldwell," she intervened in a cautious voice, "perhaps we can continue this conversation in private." "No," Richard cut her off, never taking his eyes off Emily. "I want to understand exactly who this young woman is, who claims to know more than my attorneys." He turned to face Emily directly. "If you really understand so much, then prove it. Not with pretty phrases, but with real knowledge." Emily felt the weight of every gaze upon her. The ballroom had become an arena, and she was at its center. Helen looked on the verge of a nervous breakdown, clearly fearing they would both lose their jobs before the night was over. "All right," Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "The French contract has inconsistencies in the exchange rates. You're using the euro's valuation from March, but the regulations changed in April. That translates to a difference of roughly $12 million in the final value." The financial advisor at the table grabbed his calculator, typing rapidly. After a few seconds, he looked up at Richard with an expression of disbelief. $11.7 million, he whispered. "The difference is exactly $11.7 million. A murmur rippled through the room. Emily had just pinpointed 2 critical errors in international contracts, mistakes that could have cost a fortune. And she had done it while holding a champagne tray. Richard remained silent for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through the implications. This was no longer a simple put-down of a subordinate employee. This was something far more complex and potentially embarrassing. "Interesting," he said at last, his voice controlled but with an undercurrent of tension. "Two correct observations. But that still doesn't explain how a waitress got an education sufficient to understand international contracts." Helen stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "Mr. Caldwell, please. Emily is an exemplary employee. She's worked here for 2 years without ever causing a problem." "Helen," Emily interrupted gently. "It's okay." She turned back to Richard, her eyes meeting his without wavering. "I work 16 hours a day to pay for my studies at Columbia. I wake up at 5 a.m. I work at a diner until noon, come here until 10 p.m., and then I study until 2 in the morning. I've been doing that for 3 years. And on weekends," she continued, "I go to the Brooklyn Public Library, where they have free access to international legal databases. I learn German, French, and Italian watching free video lessons on YouTube. I learned Spanish from my grandmother, who immigrated from Mexico." The room was completely silent now. Emily's story created a stark contrast with the luxurious surroundings. Here was a young woman who had built an impressive education on minimal resources, facing a man who had inherited millions and attended the world's best universities. Richard studied her face, searching for any sign of a lie or exaggeration. But he found only determination and a dignity he couldn't break, even after his attempt to humiliate her. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you learned international law in a public library?" "I'm telling you I learned it because I had to," Emily replied. "Because unlike some people, I haven't had the luxury of discarding opportunities or underestimating the value of knowledge." The tension in the air was palpable. Helen looked ready to faint, clearly imagining her career in ruins. The other guests whispered among themselves, some clearly impressed by Emily's courage, others shocked by her audacity. Richard paced around the table, like a predator circling its prey. "Very inspiring," he said with a sarcastic edge. "A real rags to riches story. But the business world doesn't run on touching anecdotes." He stopped directly in front of her. "In the real world, credentials matter. Experience matters. Connections matter. You may have memorized a few interesting facts, but that doesn't qualify you to weigh in on decisions that affect thousands of jobs." Emily felt a surge of anger but kept it in check. "So the 2 observations I just made, which could have saved your company from million-dollar losses, have no value because I don't have a degree hanging on a wall?" "Luck," Richard repeated, dismissing her achievements with a wave of his hand. "Anyone can get lucky once in a while." Helen finally found the courage to speak again. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps we can handle this more privately. We don't want this incident to disrupt the event." "What incident?" Richard asked, his voice sharp. "There has been no incident, just an employee who forgot her place and needs to be reminded of reality." He turned to Emily one last time. "Get back to your work, and next time, keep your opinions to yourself." The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. To him, Emily had been put squarely in her place, a momentary amusement he had tolerated before returning to important matters. Emily glanced at Helen, who looked devastated. The older woman had worked tirelessly to build her reputation in this exclusive world, and now she feared it was all lost because of this public showdown. "All right," Emily said finally, her voice calm but loaded with resolve. "I'll go back to my work." She picked up the tray she had set on a side table, but before she walked away, she looked directly at Richard one last time. "But Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear, "the next time you underestimate someone based on the job they do to survive, remember that you almost lost $300 million because you were too busy being arrogant to listen." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a ballroom full of whispers and a billionaire whose expression had grown considerably darker. Helen stood frozen, watching Emily retreat with a mixture of awe and terror. She knew her most dedicated employee had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she also knew that, regardless of the consequences, Emily had shown a courage she herself had never possessed. The first act was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The ballroom remained in a tense silence after Emily's departure. Richard had returned to his table, but his focus on the contracts was completely shattered. Guests whispered among themselves, some clearly torn between admiration for the young woman's courage and shock at her audacity in challenging one of Wall Street's most powerful men. Helen stood motionless for a few moments, processing what she had just witnessed. Her 15 years of organizing events for Manhattan's elite had never prepared her for a situation like this. She knew Richard Caldwell well enough to know that men like him did not forget public humiliations. Emily had returned to the service kitchen, where other waiters and waitresses were working in focused silence. But word had already spread among the staff, rumors that one of their own had confronted the event's main host. A few admiring glances mingled with expressions of concern for her future. "Girl, have you lost your mind?" whispered Rosa, an older waitress who had worked in the luxury event industry for a decade. That man could destroy your career with one phone call. Emily continued arranging her tray, her hands surprisingly steady given what had just happened. Maybe, she replied calmly. But sometimes you have to risk everything for a chance to gain something. What chance, honey? You think he's going to offer you a job after you embarrassed him in front of all these millionaires? Emily stopped what she was doing and looked at Rosa. I think he's going to want to understand how just a waitress saved his company from losing $300 million. Rosa shook her head in disbelief. What are you talking about? Before Emily could answer, Marcus, the kitchen supervisor, appeared at the door. Emily, you need to come back to the ballroom. Now. His tone was neutral, but an underlying tension made everyone stop working. Helen had sent Marcus to get Emily, and no one knew what that meant. As she prepared a new tray, Emily felt her heart still racing. Part of her regretted the boldness, especially when she thought of Helen, who had always been fair and respectful to all the staff. But a larger part felt a deep satisfaction at having finally found the courage to confront the kind of arrogance she encountered daily in her work. Back in the main hall, Richard was trying to resume his conversation with the investors, but his mind kept replaying Emily's precise comments about the contracts. How had lawyers paid thousands of dollars an hour missed errors that a waitress had spotted in minutes? Richard, said Marcus Webb, his partner of 20 years, perhaps we should review these contracts more carefully before proceeding. It's not necessary, Richard snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. They were just superficial observations, yet he knew they weren't superficial. Emily had demonstrated specific technical knowledge that went far beyond casual remarks, and that bothered him deeply. Dr. Richardson, the chief counsel who had worked with Richard for over a decade, was silently reviewing the German documents. His brows furrowed deeper as he cross-referenced the translations and legal implications. Richard, he said finally, we need to talk about this German clause. If she's right about the interpretation, she can't be right, Richard interrupted, but his voice lacked conviction. It's impossible that a waitress spotted something our legal team missed. But what if she is? Marcus Webb asked. What if there really is a problem we could have avoided? The question hung in the air. Richard knew Marcus long enough to know his partner didn't ask frivolous questions. If Marcus was concerned, there was a reason to be. 40 minutes passed. The event proceeded, with conversations about business, politics, and philanthropy flowing over champagne and canapes. But there was an undercurrent of tension, as if everyone was waiting for a second act to the drama that had unfolded earlier. Sarah Morrison, editor-in-chief of the Financial Manhattan magazine, had witnessed the entire exchange and was now circulating through the room, discreetly gathering reactions. A story was taking shape, a story about merit versus privilege that could make for a significant feature. Fascinating, isn't it? She remarked to Victoria Ashford, an investor who had built an empire after starting as a receptionist. A young woman demonstrates knowledge that surpasses expensive lawyers, and the first reaction is to dismiss her. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. It reminds me of my own experience. The difference is, I was lucky enough to find mentors who recognized potential. This girl might not be so fortunate. Across the room, James Chen, a young tech entrepreneur who had built a billion-dollar startup by age 28, watched Richard with interest. He had started out programming in public libraries because he couldn't afford his own computer, and he saw something familiar in Emily's determination. It was then that Emily returned. This time, she wasn't carrying a tray. Instead, she held a discreet folder under her arm and wore an expression of resolve that hadn't been there before. Her posture was different, more focused, more confident. Helen saw her approaching and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. The room gradually took notice of her presence. Conversations quieted as people realized the evening's drama might have a second act. Emily walked directly to Richard's table, where he was speaking with his lawyers about other matters. Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice firm but respectful. I'd like to show you something. Richard looked up slowly, his expression already one of annoyance. I don't believe you have clearance to interrupt private conversations again. You said I got lucky identifying the errors in the contracts, Emily continued, ignoring the jab. I'd like to demonstrate that it wasn't luck. She opened the folder and removed a few neatly organized documents. This is the trade agreement between Caldwell Holdings and the Japanese consortium you signed last month. Richard stood up abruptly, his face hardening. How in the hell did you get access to confidential company documents? Public documents? Emily replied calmly, anticipating the question. Filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, as required by law for all public corporations. Anyone can access them with the correct registration number, which is available on the SEC website. She pointed to a specific section of the contract. Clause 23.7 outlines penalties for delivery delays, but uses a fixed yen exchange rate set on the day of signing. The problem is, the deal was signed during a period of high currency volatility in the Asian market. If the yen devalued by more than 5% against the dollar, which it did exactly 8 days after signing, you automatically owe additional compensation calculated on the total contract value. Dr. Richardson immediately took the documents, his 40 years of experience in international commercial law allowing him to process the implications quickly. His brow furrowed as he checked the numbers and dates. How much would that compensation be? Marcus Webb asked. $42.3 million, Emily answered without hesitation, plus compounded interest of 1.2% per month since the due date. The silence that followed was deafening. To take, Richardson continued to verify the calculations, comparing historical exchange rates with the contract terms. My God, he finally muttered. How did we miss this? The currency fluctuation? She's absolutely right. Not just about the penalty, but about the compounded interest. We owe exactly, let me calculate, $46.7 million as of today. The impact of the revelation was immediate. Conversation ceased completely as the information spread through the room. Emily had just identified a nearly $50 million liability that had gone unnoticed by Manhattan's most expensive lawyers. Victoria Ashford whispered to Sarah Morrison, "This is extraordinary." She not only identified the problem, but calculated the compounded interest from memory. James Chen moved closer, clearly intrigued by the level of financial analysis demonstrated by someone who was supposedly a waitress. Richard stood frozen, processing the implications, not just financial, but professional. If Emily was right, his legal team had made a blunder that would cost the company tens of millions. Where did you learn to analyze international contracts at this level of detail? He asked at last, his voice controlled but clearly strained. Emily took a deep breath, preparing for the explanation she had mentally rehearsed hundreds of times. The Brooklyn Public Library, Central Branch at Grand Army Plaza. They have full access to the Westlaw and LexisNexis legal databases through a federal program for public access to legal information. I've spent the last 3 years, 4 nights a week, studying similar cases and learning how American companies frequently make mistakes in international contracts. She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts. The problem isn't a lack of intelligence from the lawyers. It's a lack of time for detailed analysis and an over-reliance on precedents that may not apply to specific situations. What kind of cases did you study? Dr. Richardson asked, his initial skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. Emily opened another section of her folder, revealing meticulously organized pages of handwritten notes. I started with the most famous cases: Texaco vs. Libya, Dow Chemical v. Kuwait, cases where American companies lost hundreds of millions due to contractual misunderstandings with foreign entities. She turned a few pages. Then I moved on to smaller, more recent cases. I identified specific patterns. U.S. companies consistently underestimate currency fluctuations, fail to fully grasp the implications of foreign labor laws, and assume American force majeure clauses apply universally. Marcus Webb leaned forward. You developed your own methodology? Yes. I created a 6-step verification system for each contract: currency analysis, country-specific regulatory checks, review of local legal precedents, political risk assessment, region-specific force majeure analysis, and calculation of loss scenarios under different economic conditions. The level of methodological sophistication impressed even Dr. Richardson. That's more comprehensive than many protocols we use at major firms. Because you have tight deadlines and client pressure, Emily explained. I just have curiosity and time on the weekends. James Chen finally stepped forward. May I ask how many contracts you've analyzed using this methodology? 347 over the last 2 years, Emily answered immediately. From U.S. companies doing business in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. I keep a spreadsheet with all the data. The number was staggering, not just for its quantity, but for the dedication it represented. 347 detailed analyses meant hundreds of hours of meticulous work, all done in the spare time of someone already working 16 hours a day. What's your rate of identifying potential issues? Richard asked, his initial irritation clearly giving way to genuine interest. Emily consulted her notes. 62.4% of the contracts I analyzed contained at least one significant error that could result in substantial financial losses. The average estimated loss per error is $23.8 million. How do you calculate those estimates? Dr. Richardson asked. I track the real-world outcomes whenever possible. Many of these companies end up facing the exact problems I identified. Some went to court, some renegotiated terms, others simply absorbed the losses and listed the costs in their annual reports as regulatory adjustments, or currency exchange losses. Emily turned to a specific page filled with hand-drawn charts. For example, Blackstone Enterprises signed a deal with Korean suppliers in January of this year. I identified that their force majeure clause didn't adequately cover specific South Korean environmental regulations, which have a history of changing rapidly due to public pressure. And what happened? Sarah Morrison asked, approaching with her notepad. In March, new environmental regulations were implemented by the Korean government following public protest over air pollution in Seoul. Blackstone had to renegotiate the entire contract, absorb environmental compliance costs that weren't budgeted, and pay penalties for delivery delays. Total loss, $18.2 million. And you predicted this? Marcus Webb asked. I didn't predict the specific regulations, Emily clarified. But I identified that the contract was vulnerable to environmental regulatory changes because it lacked proper protections against legislative shifts driven by public pressure, which are common in South Korea. Dr. Richardson was now completely focused on Emily's documents. May I see your full notes on the Blackstone contract? Emily handed him an entire file. Her notes were not only meticulous, but professionally organized, with color codes for different risk types and charts showing the probabilities of various scenarios. This is extraordinary, the lawyer admitted after a few minutes of analysis. Your risk analysis methodology is more thorough than many reports we get from specialized consulting firms that we pay $50,000 a project. Victoria Ashford whispered to James Chen. She single-handedly developed a methodology that rivals elite consulting firms. Imagine what she could do with proper resources. Richard remained silent for several minutes, studying the documents and observing the reactions of his lawyers and consultants. His expression had completely changed. The initial arrogance had given way to something more complex, a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and perhaps even a touch of respect. Why do you do this? He finally asked. Why spend your free time analyzing contracts for companies you don't even work for? Emily closed her folders and looked him straight in the eye. Because I want to understand how the world really works. I want to understand how decisions made in rooms like this affect people like me, and because... She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Because I believe everyone should have access to the kind of education that allows them to identify and prevent million-dollar mistakes. Everyone? Richard repeated, his voice tinged with skepticism. How many brilliant young people are waiting tables, cleaning offices, or working in call centers right now because they never got a chance to show what they're capable of? Emily asked, her voice gaining intensity. How much talent is being wasted because people like you look at someone like me and see just a waitress? The question echoed through the room with unexpected force. It was a direct accusation, but also an intellectual challenge that forced everyone present to confront their own biases about social class and merit. Helen watched the conversation with a growing sense of apprehension mixed with pride. Emily was clearly impressing the right people, but she was also directly challenging the established order that allowed events like this to exist. An interesting philosophy, Richard said slowly. But the business world doesn't run on idealism. It runs on results, credentials, and proven experience. Like the results I just showed you? Emily countered, gesturing to the documents. Like the experience of analyzing 347 international contracts? Like the credentials I've earned by studying real-world cases with a methodology your own lawyers just praised? It's not the same, Richard replied, but his voice lacked its former conviction. Why not? Emily pressed. Because I didn't pay $200,000 for a Harvard MBA? Because I didn't have family connections that secured me internships at prestigious firms? Is the knowledge I've demonstrated less valid because I obtained it unconventionally? James Chen stepped forward. Excuse me, he said, addressing Richard. May I make an observation? I built my company starting exactly like her, studying on my own, developing my own methodologies, and being initially dismissed for not having traditional credentials. The difference is, I got lucky and found an investor who saw potential beyond appearances. James's intervention shifted the dynamic. Here was a renowned billionaire validating Emily's experience based on his own journey. The tension in the room was palpable. Emily had turned the conversation from a discussion of technical competence into a fundamental questioning of merit versus privilege, and now she had support from other influential people in the room. Marcus Webb leaned forward. Emily, may I ask a hypothetical question? If you had all the necessary resources, funding, a team, technology, what would you do with this knowledge you've developed? Emily thought for a moment before answering, mentally organizing the proposal she had been developing for years. I would create an educational institute focused on international business for young people from underserved communities. Not a traditional school, but an intensive program that would teach contract analysis, international regulations, and risk assessment methodologies. How would it work in practice? Victoria Ashford asked, clearly intrigued. Partnerships with public libraries to ensure access to legal and financial databases. Intensive weekend workshops on region-specific contract analysis. One-on-one mentorship with experienced professionals. And most importantly, real-world projects where students analyze public contracts and present their findings to the companies involved. Emily grew animated as she explained her vision. The goal wouldn't just be to teach theory, but to develop practical skills that would make these young people immediately valuable to companies doing global business. How many people would it benefit? Asked Marcus. In Brooklyn alone, there are at least 50,000 young people between 18 and 25 working low-wage jobs while trying to pay for higher education, Emily replied, having clearly researched the numbers. If just 10% had access to proper training in international business, that's 5,000 young people with specialized skills that are currently being completely wasted. And what would be the return on investment? Richard asked, his business mind automatically evaluating the proposal. Conservatively? If each program participant eventually identified just one contractual error per year, based on my 62% success rate, we would be talking about preventing approximately $75 billion in annual losses for American companies. The numbers were staggering, but Emily continued, more importantly, we would be creating a specialized workforce that could make American companies more competitive in international markets. It was then that Emily pulled more documents from her main folder. Actually, she said, there's something else I need to show you, something that can't wait. She placed a new folder on the table. These are the contracts you are set to sign tonight, here at this event. Richard stood up abruptly, his face hardening again. How in the hell did you get access to contracts that haven't even been finalized? Those documents are strictly confidential. I didn't have access to the final contracts, Emily replied calmly, anticipating his reaction. But I knew which contracts were being signed because Helen asked me to help prepare the meeting rooms where the signings will take place. The company names were on the place cards and in the event schedule. Helen went pale. Emily, you shouldn't have used that information. With the company names and dates, it was relatively easy to find preliminary versions of the contracts in the public filings of the European companies involved. Emily continued. Public European companies are required to disclose more details about pending contracts than American companies are. And what did you find? Dr. Richardson asked, his professional curiosity overriding any ethical concerns. The contract with Germany's Bergmann Industries contains a clause that seems standard, but it actually shifts significant liability for labor issues to the American party, Emily explained. Specifically, Article 27, Section B states that in the event of Arbeitsstreitigkeiten, labor disputes, the American company will assume all resolution costs. And what's the problem with that? Richard asked. Arbeitsstreitigkeiten, in German legal terms, doesn't just mean strikes or direct contractual disputes. It also includes government-mandated labor regulatory changes that affect company operations. In Germany, that could include anything from changes in maximum work hours to new requirements for environmental benefits. Dr. Richardson quickly grabbed the documents, his eyes scanning the German text. Where is this clause exactly? Article 27, Section B, Subsection 3, Emily replied. The language is intentionally obscure, likely to mask its true implications. After a few minutes of intense reading, the lawyer looked up, his expression growing more severe. She's right, completely right. This clause could make us liable for any change in German labor laws that affects Bergmann's operations. We're talking about a potential risk of tens of millions. The ballroom was now completely silent, with everyone processing the implications of Emily identifying yet another major error that had slipped past experienced lawyers. There's more, Emily continued, her confidence growing with each validation of her analysis. The contract with Dubois and Associates includes an arbitration clause that requires all disputes to be resolved exclusively in French courts, using only precedents from French law. And the problem is? Marcus Webb asked. It means you would be completely waiving your right to sue in American courts, even if the issues directly affect U.S. operations or employees. More problematically, French law does not recognize many of the protections American companies assume as standard, particularly related to intellectual property and technology transfer. Dr. Richardson was now completely engrossed in the French documents. My God, she's right again. How did our team not catch this? And finally, Emily pressed on before anyone could answer. The Italian contract establishes a penalty system for delays that essentially doubles every 7 days. It looks standard at first glance, but there's a significant technical issue. What issue? Richard asked, now clearly invested in her every word. The penalties are calculated based on the promised delivery date, but there are no adequate protections for delays caused by U.S. customs regulations. If there's any issue with American customs, from policy changes to simple administrative backup, you could owe hundreds of millions in a matter of weeks. How much specifically? Marcus asked. Emily consulted her detailed notes. Based on the total contract value of 80 million euros, a delay of just 4 weeks would result in penalties of approximately $320 million. A 2-month delay would be financially devastating for any company. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that Emily had identified risks that could literally destroy Richard's company if they materialized. Dr. Richardson was methodically checking each point she raised, consulting both the documents and legal databases on his tablet. His expression grew more strained with each verification. "All of these points are correct," he finally announced, his voice filled with disbelief. "Every analysis is accurate. If we had signed these contracts as they are, we would be taking on financial risks that could easily exceed the company's liquid assets." Marcus Webb looked at Richard, then at Emily. "You just saved us from potential losses of, what would you estimate in total?" Emily had anticipated the question. "Conservatively, considering only moderate risk scenarios, $200 to $300 million in the first 2 years. In high-risk scenarios, like significant regulatory changes in Europe or prolonged customs issues, it could easily reach 500 million or more." The number was so staggering it brought the room to a complete standstill. A waitress had identified contractual risks that could have bankrupted one of Wall Street's most established firms. James Chen shook his head in admiration. "In my experience building companies, I've rarely seen risk analysis this comprehensive done by entire teams of expensive consultants." Victoria Ashford whispered to Sarah Morrison, "This needs to be documented. This young woman is redefining how we think about unconventional talent." Richard remained motionless for long minutes, processing not only the financial aspects, but the broader implications of what he had witnessed. His worldview had been fundamentally challenged. The young woman he had dismissed as just a waitress had demonstrated an analytical competence that consistently surpassed his own specialized advisors. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked finally, his voice far more subdued than before. Emily took a deep breath. This was the central question she had been waiting for all night. "Because it was no coincidence that I was working this specific event tonight." A murmur went through the room. Everyone present immediately understood there were additional layers to the story that had yet to be revealed. "Helen didn't randomly schedule me to work this event," Emily continued, glancing briefly at her supervisor with an apologetic look. "I specifically requested to work here when I learned through the public schedule that you would be present and that major contracts were being signed." Helen looked genuinely confused and slightly betrayed. "But Emily, you said you urgently needed the extra hours to pay tuition." "I said that because I couldn't explain the whole truth at the time, without it sounding like I was planning something harmful," Emily replied gently. "The truth is, I spent 3 weeks analyzing every public contract related to this event, and the companies we knew would be represented." Richard took a step forward, his expression now one of intense intrigue. "You came here tonight with the specific intention of confronting me?" "I came here with the specific intention of saving your company from potentially devastating losses," Emily corrected firmly. "The confrontation only became necessary because you chose to humiliate me publicly instead of listening to what I had to say." The precision and honesty of her answer impressed everyone. Emily had carefully planned every move, anticipating both Richard's initial arrogance and her own need to establish credibility through concrete demonstrations. "And what exactly do you expect to gain from all this?" Richard asked, his voice now laced with cautious respect. Emily closed her folders and looked him directly in the eye, without flinching or hesitation. "I want 3 specific things." The room remained in absolute silence, awaiting her demands. "First, a full scholarship to complete my studies at Columbia, including living expenses so I can stop working 16 hours a day and focus completely on my education. Second, a structured internship program at your company where I can apply and develop the knowledge I've demonstrated today, working directly with your legal team on real contract analyses. And third, seed funding to create the educational institute I described, a program that would give hundreds of other talented young people the same opportunities I'm asking for myself." The audacity and specificity of her demands stunned everyone. Emily wasn't just asking for a job or recognition. She was proposing a structured partnership that would benefit not only her, but potentially thousands of other young people in similar situations. "In exchange for what, specifically?" Richard asked. "In exchange for continuing to do exactly what I just demonstrated," Emily replied with growing confidence. "Identifying risks your expensive teams miss, finding opportunities in international markets your traditional consultants may not fully understand, and proving through concrete results that investing in unconventional talent can be significantly more profitable than hiring only people with traditional pedigrees. Marcus Webb whispered something to Richard, who nodded thoughtfully as he processed the proposal. "And if I say no to your demands?" Richard asked, testing her resolve. Emily smiled for the first time that night, an expression that combined confidence with a hint of respectful challenge. "Then you will have missed an extraordinary opportunity to transform not only your company, but also the lives of thousands of young people who have the potential to contribute significantly to America's international competitiveness. And you'll just go back to serving champagne?" "I will go back to serving champagne," Emily agreed calmly. "But I will continue to analyze public contracts and identify the multi-million-dollar mistakes that companies like yours regularly make. The difference is, next time, I won't be sharing that information with you for free." The implication was clear and powerful. Emily had proven she possessed extremely valuable knowledge and skills that could either benefit or harm companies, depending on how she was treated. But Emily still had one last card to play. "In fact," she said, pulling a small digital device from her folder, "there's one final thing I need to mention." Richard furrowed his brow, looking at the small object in her hands. "What is that?" "A high-quality digital recorder," Emily replied with absolute composure. "I have recorded our entire conversation tonight, from the moment you called me just a waitress." The silence that followed was tense and fraught with implications. Everyone in the room immediately understood the strategic significance of what she had just revealed. "Why did you record our conversation?" Richard asked, his voice controlled but clearly strained. "Because I've learned through extensive research that powerful men often change their minds or deny agreements when they are no longer under public social pressure," Emily explained with brutal honesty. "I wanted to ensure that any deal we made here tonight would be honored, and that there would be a clear record of everything that was said and promised." The complete candor of her answer impressed even those who were already in awe of her preparation. Emily had anticipated not only Richard's initial resistance, but also the possibility that he might try to back out of commitments made in public. Richard studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of manipulation or malice. Instead, he found only strategic determination and an intelligence that had consistently surpassed his expectations throughout the night. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, not with condescension or irritation, but with something approaching genuine admiration. "You really thought of absolutely everything, didn't you?" "I've had 3 years to plan for this moment," Emily replied. "I couldn't afford to improvise or leave anything to chance." The second act had come to an end, with Emily firmly in control not only of the conversation but of the entire situation. She had demonstrated exceptional technical competence, sophisticated strategic vision, and meticulous preparation that rivaled the most seasoned executives. The real transformation was just beginning. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the modern educational center in the heart of Brooklyn, casting golden patterns on the polished wood floors. The contrast with the lavish Manhattan gala couldn't have been more striking. Here, young people from all ethnic and economic backgrounds hunched over documents and computers, their focused expressions mirroring the same intensity Emily had shown on that transformative night. Richard Caldwell walked through the halls of the International Business Analysis Institute, watching students debate contract clauses in Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin. His own attire was simpler than his once impeccable suits. A light blue button-down and cotton trousers made him seem more approachable, more human. "Mr. Caldwell," called Maria Santos, a 19-year-old whose family had immigrated from El Salvador when she was 12. "Can you review my analysis of the contract between Tesla and their Mexican suppliers?" Richard approached the table where Maria had spread out documents covered in detailed bilingual notes. 6 months ago, he would have walked right past someone like her, another anonymous face on his journey to accumulate wealth. Now he sat down beside her, carefully studying her work. "Interesting observation about the environmental regulations," he said, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. "You've identified something our own legal team might have missed." Maria smiled, but her eyes remained focused on the documents. "Emily taught us that small details often hide enormous risks." Across the room, Emily was working with a group of college students who attended the program on weekends. She had changed too, not just physically, with clothes better suited to her new role as educational director, but in her presence. There was a natural confidence that came from seeing her ideas transformed into tangible reality. "Remember," she was telling the students gathered around her table, "you're not competing with Harvard or Wharton. You're offering something those institutions can't: real-world perspective, experience with resource limitations, and a hunger to succeed that can't be bought." James Chen had become a regular mentor at the program, stopping by weekly to share his experiences in building companies. On this particular morning, he watched Emily work with growing admiration. "She's achieved something most educators take decades to develop," he commented to Helen, who now supervised the Institute's administrative operations. "The ability to inspire without making unrealistic promises." Helen nodded, still processing how her own life had changed so dramatically. "Sometimes I still can't believe that determined waitress became all this." "She was always this," James corrected gently. "She just never had the opportunity to show it before." Victoria Ashford had become chair of the Institute's advisory board, using her investment expertise to ensure the program's financial sustainability. Her presence this morning was for an important meeting. The Institute's first measurable results were being presented. "In 6 months," Victoria announced to the group gathered in the conference room, "our 53 initial students have identified contractual errors that have saved our partner companies a combined $128 million in potential losses." The numbers impressed even those who had backed the project from the start. Sarah Morrison, who had been documenting the story since the gala, was there to follow the developments. "More importantly," Victoria continued, 17 of our students have received internship offers from firms that would have initially rejected them based on their traditional resumes alone." Emily stood to present the most significant part of the report. "But the numbers don't tell the whole story," she said, her voice carrying the passion that had captivated Richard that night in Manhattan. "Maria discovered a vulnerability in mining contracts that is helping American companies avoid environmental issues in Latin America. Jose identified patterns in Asian trade agreements that are redefining how tech companies approach intellectual property." She gestured to the students in attendance. "Every one of them has brought unique perspectives that traditional consultants simply couldn't offer." Richard watched Emily present with a mixture of pride and reflection. 6 months ago, he had nearly dismissed the person who was now transforming not only individual lives, but potentially an entire approach to talent development in international business. After the presentation, he found a moment alone with Emily on the Institute's rooftop terrace, which overlooked the Manhattan skyline where it had all begun. "Did you know it would work?" he asked, gazing at the skyscrapers that had once represented a world inaccessible to young people, like those now studying at the Institute. "I hoped it would work," Emily answered honestly. "But seeing the actual results, it's more gratifying than I ever imagined." Richard was silent for a few moments, processing his own transformation. "You taught me something fundamental that night." "May? What was that?" "That real wealth isn't what I've accumulated over the years. It's what I can do to multiply opportunities for others." Emily smiled, remembering the arrogance he had displayed just months before. "And what have you discovered about your own motivations?" "I've discovered that building people is more satisfying than building a portfolio," he admitted. "When Maria got that internship at Goldman Sachs last week, I felt more pride than when I closed my first $100 million deal." The honesty of his reflection showed how much he had changed. The man who had publicly humiliated a waitress now found meaning in empowering young people he would have previously ignored. "There's something I want to show you," Emily said, leading him back inside the Institute. She took him to a special room he hadn't yet visited, a modest but carefully organized library, with workstations equipped with access to the same legal databases Emily had used at the Brooklyn Public Library. "This is the most important part of everything we've built," she explained. "A space where curiosity and determination can compete with privilege and connections." On the wall, a discreet plaque read, "Dedicated to all the young people who refuse to be defined by the circumstances of their birth." Richard read the plaque in silence, processing how his own privileged circumstances had blinded him to the talent that existed all around him. Just then, Dr. Richardson walked into the room, carrying a familiar folder. Over the past 6 months, he had become a regular contributor to the Institute, offering legal expertise and becoming genuinely impressed with the quality of analysis the students produced. "Richard, I need to show you something," he said, opening the folder. "Remember the contract with Bergman Industries that Emily identified problems with that night?" "Of course. We renegotiated the terms based on her observations." "Well, it happened exactly as she predicted. Changes in German labor laws would have cost us $42 million if we'd signed the original contract. Her modifications saved us completely." Dr. Richardson turned a few pages. "And the Italian contract? The issue with delay penalties she spotted?" "The company ran into customs problems just as she anticipated. If we'd signed the original terms, we would owe $200 million in penalties right now." The numbers completely validated Emily's competence, but more importantly, they demonstrated the tangible value of unconventional perspectives in contract analysis. "She literally saved my company," Richard murmured, more to himself than to the others. "No," Emily corrected, stepping closer. I showed you that talent exists in places you weren't looking. The real transformation happened when you decided to actively seek out that talent. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Webb, who had become an enthusiastic supporter of the project after seeing consistent results. "Richard, we have an interesting proposal," he announced. 3 Fortune 500 companies want to establish similar partnerships with institutes in their home cities. Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami are offering funding to replicate the model. The news represented an expansion beyond Emily's most optimistic expectation. How many young people could that impact? Conservatively, 1,000 students in the first 2 years, Marcus replied. But with the scalable model you've developed, potentially many more. Victoria Ashford joined the conversation with updated financial figures. The return on investment is exceeding all projections. For every dollar invested in the program, we are seeing a $17 return in avoided losses for partner companies. More importantly, added James Chen, we are creating a new class of professionals who combine technical competence with social perspectives that traditional companies can't replicate. Emily watched the numbers and expansion plans with satisfaction, but also with an awareness that true success would be measured in human transformations, not just financial metrics. "May I propose something?" she said finally. Everyone turned to her, recognizing that her ideas had consistently exceeded expectations. "I want us to establish a foundational rule for any expansion. 50% of the mentors and instructors must be people who started in circumstances similar to the students. Not just well-meaning professionals, but people who have truly understood the barriers these young people face. The proposal would ensure authenticity and relevance as the program grew. And I want every student who graduates from the program to commit at least 1 year to mentoring the next generation, not as an obligation, but as an investment in the cycle of opportunity." Richard nodded immediately. That would guarantee sustainability and organic growth. As the meeting came to a close, Emily found herself alone again with Richard on the rooftop, watching the bustle of the city that had witnessed their mutual transformation. "Do you have any regrets about that night?" he asked. Emily thought carefully before answering. "No regrets. But I'm aware that not every talented young person will get the chance to publicly confront a billionaire and emerge successful. That's why this institute is so important. And I've learned that humility isn't a sign of weakness," Richard reflected. "It's recognizing that intelligence and potential exist regardless of privilege or credentials." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group of students who had recently completed the program. Maria was among them, now wearing a sharp suit that reflected her new position as a junior analyst at an international consulting firm. "Emily," Maria said, "we wanted to thank you personally, but more than that, we wanted to show you something." She handed a folder to Emily. "We analyzed the upcoming contracts your old event planning company is organizing. We found 3 significant issues that could save their clients from substantial losses." Emily opened the folder, immediately recognizing the same meticulous methodology she had developed, now being applied independently by her students. "You did this on your own initiative? You taught us that knowledge without action is just intellectual entertainment," replied Jose, another program graduate. "We want to make sure others don't face the same barriers we did." The students' initiative represented the program's true success. Young people who not only acquired skills, but developed a mindset of social leadership. As the day came to a close, Emily prepared for a television interview that would document the Institute's journey. Sarah Morrison had arranged for national coverage, recognizing that the story represented something larger than individual success. "What is the most important message you want to convey?" Sarah asked during the prep session. Emily looked out the window at the students still working diligently, then toward the Manhattan skyline where her journey had begun. "Never underestimate someone just because they haven't had the same opportunities as you," she said, her voice carrying the conviction forged by personal experience. "Talent is everywhere. Opportunity is not. Our responsibility is to build bridges between talent and opportunity, regardless of where we find that talent." The interview aired 3 days later, reaching millions and inspiring similar initiatives in dozens of cities. Emily had achieved something rare, transforming a personal experience of humiliation into a social movement that multiplied opportunities for countless other young people. Richard watched the interview from his office, reflecting on how a single night had redefined not only his perspective, but his legacy. Instead of being remembered as just another billionaire who accumulated wealth, he was now building something that would endure beyond his own lifetime. The International Business Analysis Institute continued to grow, but more importantly, it continued to transform lives and challenge assumptions about where talent can be found. The story of Emily and Richard became a symbol that confronting prejudice can benefit not only those who are underestimated, but also those who do the underestimating. 6 months after that transformative gala, Both had learned that true greatness comes not from defending positions of power, but from using that power to lift others up. The journey of a determined waitress and an arrogant billionaire had become a legacy of multiplied opportunities and realized potential. The final transformation came during a conversation Richard had with his own son, a 22-year-old who had grown up with every privilege Richard could offer. "Dad," the young man said after visiting the institute, "I want to work here. I want to learn from people who have actually fought for everything they've achieved." Richard smiled, recognizing that the cycle of transformation had come full circle. Emily's lesson had even extended to the next generation of his own family. The true measure of success was not in the millions saved or the awards received, but in the lives that continued to be transformed, one opportunity at a time. Emily had proven that when exceptional talent meets the right opportunity, the impact can reverberate far beyond any initial expectation. Did you enjoy this inspiring story of transformation and overcoming adversity? If you believe talent is everywhere, subscribe for more stories about courage, determination, and social change. Share with someone who needs to be reminded that their circumstances don't define their potential. And comment below. What was the most impactful moment in Emily's journey for you? What barriers have you overcome in your own life?